I would like to hear, what would you like to learn most from someone in a different regional context? Obviously related to the topic of transforming masculinities, engaging boys and men. But yeah, that is the question. It could be something about how people work in other regions, how people organize, how programming works or is implemented, designed, or it could be about cultural norms. What do you want to learn about the norms and values that are shaping ideas around gender or this work to transform masculinities? So that's the question, and that's really focusing in on this. The point that I'm most interested in personally to be here for is to find out what we can learn from each other across regions. So I'm going to pause there, and would someone like to go first? Tell us your name, where you're calling in from today, and yeah, what is your response to that question?
Okay, I can go first.
Thanks, Juliet. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I would like to learn from the other regions is how, whether the main groups in their countries are working with the mainstream women's organizations. I just recently found out that in Zambia, we do things differently. In most of the regions, what has happened is that the men have come up with a movement to work on issues of masculinity, patriarchy, gender discrimination, gender-based violence. But in Zambia, the way it started is that the women's movement, the different organizations that work on gender issues, introduced within their own organizations what we call men's networks and boys networks. So like, for example, Zambia National Women's Lobby, it was formed in 1991. Later, around 1998, we realized that because we operate in a very patriarchal and cultural and traditional society, we decided that we should embrace men, work with them, train them on gender issues, and those now are the men that have grown the movement within our organizations. So we have different organizations, and the men in those organizations are the ones that drive this way, but they still fall under the women's movement. We have recently there was just one organization that was formed by the men themselves. But if you look at the people that formed that organizations, they emanated from the women's organization. So I wanted to find out whether there's that relationship between the women's movement and the men's groups. And also what I found out was that in certain countries, the traditional women's movement groups don't want to work with the men's groups. They feel that the men have come to get their space and so on and so on. So I just wanted to find out that it's something that I found out recently, because for us in Zambia, we embrace men, we work with men, we don't find any problems with that.
Thanks, Juliet. Great first point, and I'm curious to explore that further in a little while. Before we do, I'm going to go around the circle a little bit. Shall we? So that's one excellent starting question. I'm going to do one region at a time. Let's do it that way. So why don't we see if we can... Marcel, can you hear well now? Because I'm not sure if we heard from you.
I can hear you.
Yeah, great. Welcome. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much.
We can hear you as well. So yeah, what would be your one thing that you'd like to share that you'd like to learn from other regions?
Well, in the first place, let me agree with what Juliet has just indicated, that most of the men's organizations advancing issues of gender equality have actually emerged from the women's movement. And I think in Malawi, it's not the exception. We initially emerged out of the program that was predominantly a women's program. but looking at the gaps that were there to enlist men to be able to embrace gender equality and also to transform themselves for the betterment of society and for the betterment of everyone. That's why the programs to do with men for gender equality now in Malawi commence. So far, I think one of the things why women organizations have not really found a problem with us is that we have been able to work with women's organizations because we're not just doing this work for the sake of ourselves as men. I think that's one key accountability issue we need to be looking at as men's organizations. We are not a movement of men addressing men's rights primarily. We are a grouping of men conscious of the power imbalances and willing to do something to address inequalities. By addressing our own masculinities from the dominant forms to more subtle forms so that we create a fair space for both men and women. So our approach in Malawi has been quite useful in that we are targeting male-dominated institutions. So like you are aware, as the situation stands now, we still have more men who are parliamentarians. We have more men who are religious leaders. We have more men who are in other professions. The Malawi Police Service is more men. The Malawi Army is more men. The main electricity generation company, most of the technical jobs, almost 3/4, all men. As I'm talking today, we are already facilitating a process to build capacity for the electricity generation company of Malawi, which is a statutory corporation, where almost thousands and thousands, mostly in technical jobs, are men. And therefore, the space for women becomes lesser. So by demasculating or bringing relatively subtle forms of masculinities from the current dominant ones, we are creating more space for women to join this company and also to transform their gender policies and social inclusion policies so that they bring in space for women to join the more technical organizations in Malawi. So I think women's organizations have seen that we have not necessarily come to get their space. They are seeing our role to be complementary because these structures we are confronting, the women's organizations have tried, and sometimes they do a lot of effort with them, but with relatively minimum, deliverables. So by working together, ourselves as men's networks and the women's movement, together we are able to achieve a little bit much more than was the case when women were advancing these issues alone to try to dismantle the patriarchy and bring in a little bit subtle forms of masculinity. So I strongly believe that in our case in Malawi, there is no antagonism between the women's networks and the men's organization. Maybe in the near future, but as it stands now, there is that collaborative understanding that together we can make a greater difference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. So that's great. Already exploring the differences there with comparison to what Juliet was sharing about the origins of this kind of work in Zambia compared to your experience in Malawi. So that's great. Shall we go on to South Asia? Sanjog, what would you like to learn from other regions?
Hello everyone, I'm Sanjog from Nepal and I'm representing the organization called Hami Daju. It's a Nepali brothers. It's the only organization in our country which is totally focused on working with men and boys on ending gender-based violence and further gender justice. So I'd also like to echo that what Juliet and Marcel was saying, that I also like to know that how pro-feminist movement has been taken or considered by the feminist movement of different reason, because there's always there's a group who accept and welcome, but at the same time there's a group who is also very much reserved on that issue. And I don't see that as a big problem, because I see the reason of reservation is linked with the accountability of men as well. So there could be a scope as well, but I would like to see more on that. At the same time, I would also like to know the sustaining the engagement of men and bringing their lifelong commitment that it's not that easy that we talked right now, but I would like to know how the other regions are practicing that. So these two things would be very interesting to hear and discuss furthermore. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjog. So yeah, a couple of good questions there. We can explore in a bit more detail. Again, things I'd be really interested to learn about. How is the pro-feminist movement perceived in the broader field in different regions, working for gender justice? So yeah, and bringing lifelong commitment, such a challenge in any region, I imagine. Reefat, do you have anything you'd like to add, or what would you like to learn from different regions?
Thank you, Tom. First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm Reefat bin Satar. I am working as a Director Program Development and Quality with Save the Children Bangladesh, and also I'm the country coordinator for Bangladesh for the MENEngage network. And in that capacity, I'm here. First of all, a disclaimer. Basically, I'm over about a year with this network I'm working. So probably the other panelists here has much more experience than I have. So definitely, I want to learn a lot of things from other colleagues here. So I have a big list. I can give a big list, but I just know that's not possible here. So I am with I'm bit struggling to prioritize where to start from. So I will just, my previous panelists, they already have mentioned a couple of things. I totally agree on that. I think certainly that would be something good to hear from other regions. I was just wondering two things. One is that different countries have different contexts, but in terms of patriarchy, in terms of the vulnerabilities, in terms of the exclusions, in terms of the challenges, I think more or less those have a lot of commonalities there. So, but the approaches might vary in different countries depending on the context. So, and also I would say that the leadership, political leadership, is changing. We see a dramatic shift of political leadership across the world. We see a more dictatorial people are coming in the fold of democratic fold. I mean, they're coming as a democracy, but basically they are in nature quite dictatorial. And when it's a dictatorial thing, basically that's also very much founded of patriarchy concept. And in many cases, the movements and all those things, the civil society space is really shrinking. That's happening across the world. Be it Latin America, be it Europe, be it in Asia. So within that context, I was thinking how these movements we are talking about, because this is a critical actor in the society that can make some changes, that want to drive some changes, be it youth movement, be it child rights movement, be it feminist movement. Then there is a big political leadership political governments, especially with this dictatorial thinking. Then there is a huge market actor, because we know private sector has a huge influence in the policy level discussions, in the knowledge level discussions, and then the academics, because many of those discourse that we are talking about at development level has to do a lot of knowledge level thinking as well, because if you want to change the communities, it is not always possible with the NGO sector. We also need to include the creative sector from design perspective, because the exclusion is designed. It's a systemically designed thing. So we have to change it through design again. It could be through creative means, it could be through market means, it could be through NGO work. So how these different sectors work in your even different regions, I would really love to hear that. And secondly, when we talk about learning, in most cases, we want to talk about what we are doing great. Often we don't want to talk what we learned from the failures. We don't want to talk about that much. So I would also love to hear from other regions is that what are those failed things that we tried? We tried with good intention, honest intention, with good ambition, but somehow it failed. And then how sort of we have turned it around, if possible, if we did that, any good evidence on that? Failed movement, but probably we have tried to turn it around as much as possible. So these two things.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I like to hear about the things that went wrong. I think we can learn more often from the things maybe not went wrong, but didn't go 100% how we wanted. Of course, we've got to learn from those things. So yeah, we'll be great to hear about that. And how are different sectors working together in different regions? Another really useful and interesting topic to explore, which we can get to later. So yeah, let's get on to Europe. I'm gonna, as I said before, we'll finish with Layla. And that means Shay, you're up next. What would you like to learn from the other regions?
Yeah. I hesitate. As you can see, I'm a white old man, and I live in a country and have lived for nearly 70 years in a country that has been in the main monocultural. And it is when I sit into these spaces that I see people of color. And I sit in Europe as a co-coordinator of European MenEngage, which is pretty well all white. And so I'm sitting after 4 weeks of Ubuntu Symposium, listening and watching and trying to learn about decolonization and looking at our Eurocentrism, where we have been at the center of power over hundreds of years. Ireland is a place that was colonized, it still is partly colonized, depending where you're standing. So I'm sitting in that and looking at the development of MenEngage Europe to see how it is we can develop to be more, to be less centric, to be less looking at ourselves. I think we're good at developing programs. We're good at working with people on the margins, but we're not really good at bringing the attention of the mainstream to the work of pro-feminism. So I'm sitting with a lot of challenges at this time, and still learning. I spent a career, as Tom said earlier, in communications, at the center of power and at the center of economic and political power up to 15, 20 years ago. And I'm now sitting at the edge looking in, so seeing things differently and sitting with people like yourselves, with colleagues, and looking for inspiration and challenge to the way that we have lived in the world and that I have lived in the world. So I'm looking for that kind of challenge. And I know for me, it is a place of discomfort to sit into a conversation about race and ethnicity and colonization. And if it is, and I also know it's my task to do the learning, not your task to do the teaching. So there's that dance that as an old white man, I find my limbs are rickety and stuck in the practice of being this man. And I seek to hear really clear challenge. Yeah. And if it is that you can make a contribution and an impact on MenEngage Europe in that way, I would be really grateful. Thank you.
Wow, so no small task there for the other regions, but yeah, I was listening to that reminded me that I forgot to introduce myself, because I'm also from a similarly Eurocentric context. So I'm from the UK as well. So also, yeah, listening and hearing your words a lot, Shay. So reflecting on that's a really crucial aspect of being here. So thanks for reminding me as well. Yeah, Layla, so saving you till last, if you would like to share what you'd like to learn from other regions.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and sorry for being a little bit late. I'm just going to introduce myself briefly. I'm coming from Croatia, which is Central Europe or or Western Balkans, depends where you are standing. So I'm I'm a member of a European Steering Committee, and this is why I'm here. But I'm thinking now about diversity that we have in Europe, because I would say that my experience and position and geographical position is completely different from my colleagues Tom and She. Thinking about what I would like to learn, actually, I would still think that Europe is quite diverse. Maybe it's not visible from outside because, yes, we are more or less all white, like She was saying. And also in my region, for example, we would, I don't know, all look the same and more or less have the same or similar religions. And this is something that in Balkan is a very big identity issue. But actually, when people would look inside, that there is a big diversity. And I'm also questioning how good or bad we are in including everyone, and how good or bad we are in recognizing and giving power to everyone. And I think we are failing a lot, not only in matter of race, but also I'm thinking now about Roma minority, for example, in my region and in my country, who are really not recognized, and they are present in here. So I also feel that somehow we are failing a little bit. But coming back to our masculinity issues, I would like to learn from other regions, and this is what I'm really interested about. We are really struggling with this huge anti-feminist backlash, and I would really like to know how my colleagues in other regions recognize it, and do they recognize it, and then how do they deal with it? Because somehow for us and for our daily work, I'm coming from a very small organization who is working dominantly with men or people who define themselves as male. And we are a part of we are also being really attacked a lot within this anti-feminist movement. And it's hard to deal with it. Somehow in a daily life, it's very hard to deal with it. So I would like to see how our colleagues around the world are doing, and how do they see this intersectionality and this moments of how can we be more strong or do it better than we are. So thank you.
Thanks, Leila. Yeah, thank you everyone, and thanks Leila for those great points as well. It sparked another question in me. I won't put it out there just yet, but I'd be interested, again, as someone from Europe. I'm actually now based in Australia. I've gone from one kind of dominant Western culture to another that's, you know, not based in geographical West, but in the kind of historical power dynamic West. But yeah, it's the question I have is, what does diversity look like in other regions as well? Because I'm seeing other regions and I wonder if they look diverse to me because I'm from a white background and I'm from that kind of background that doesn't recognize like true diversity. Maybe I'm seeing people who look kind of from one region and to me, I'm homogenizing them or making them like one monolithic group and saying, oh, that's a very diverse context, but maybe it's not. And maybe that's actually, you know, itself from being from a kind of white supremacist culture, seeing it like that. And actually, what does diversity look like in other regions? So we won't go on to that now because I've got a whole list of questions and areas from that. And I genuinely don't know what to go to first. I want to go back a little bit to the beginning, which was Juliet's question around it's basically going back to the historical roots of men transforming masculinities, bringing men in on gender equality. This is what I understood from Juliet, from your question, is how did the movement this movement, so to speak, develop in different regions? For example, Juliet shared that it was really women's gender justice organizations, women-led organizations that brought programming in to engage with men. And then we had another question from I think it was from Sanjog, talking about how the movement is perceived. So they're kind of related. How is it? What were the origins? How is the perception now? And yeah, I think we can explore that. So maybe we can go back to South Asia on that question. Like how have you seen the movement or the work with men and boys, at least, and transforming masculinities develop? And is it in contrast to what Juliet was sharing? Before I do that, I'm just going to ask Juliet, does that kind of reflect what your question was? And shall we go, yeah, Juliet, do you want to share anything else to clarify that question?
Yes, you summarized my question well.
Perfect. So yeah, how about Sanjog? What's your experience then, or from what you've seen in your region or your country context, of what is the kind of origins of this work? Has it been led by women's rights and women-led organizations who have thought, let's bring in men and boys? Or is it are you seeing more organizations who have actually been led by men?
You know that from 2004, when the MENEngage Alliance was formed, and in 2007 when in Nepal the MENEngage Alliance in Nepal was formed, and after that there's lots of the discourse has been happening, especially from the development organization side, like UN is talking, INGOs are talking, NGOs are talking, but it's more in a very, I would say, the projectize more, it's less movement itself. Like when we say the feminist, it's like the movement, you know that. But in terms of the, when I see the MENEngage, I don't see the movement as such. So I think that's something. It's also because the feminist movement is questioning us, is also because in this span of time, you know, that more than 1 decade we've been here in our country or the region, but we're not able to create the momentum on engaging men and boys in terms of transforming the masculinity. So it's very important for us. And recently, along with MENEngage Alliance, we organized the Nepal's first Feminism and Men conference, and we realized many prominent feminist figures are not aware about pro-feminist movement or the engaging men and boys, and even not aware of MENEngage Alliance itself, which also help us to reflect that a lot of knowledge building is required in terms of that. And many people are also very reserved in terms of engaging men and boys. And there's two very important reasons that they've given us. And I think that we also need to reflect. Number one, most of the sphere, either it's a political or economic, it is led by men. So again, when we talked about the MENEngage, it will also create another opportunity for men, and which will be kind of occupying women's space. So you know that this kind of thing is coming up. So I always say that the conceptual clarity is very important, not only among men, but also among all the feminists as well, to have that when we say MENEngage, what it is and what is not. Like I think Marcel has clearly said that MENEngagement is not about the forcing or amplifying the voices of men rights activists. It's becoming an ally of the feminist movement. So this kind of conceptual clarity is very important. And you know that when we introduce ourselves as a Nepali brothers, not only some of the feminists who praise us or we welcome us, there are also some men rights perspective people. They think that we are the men rights activists, you know, that our term is Nepali brother. So this kind of confusion is always there. So I think that why the pro-feminists, the feminists are not welcoming that much to us is that there's the lack of the clarity, but at the same time, they had experience of working with men and boys, and there's always the issue of accountability, which is never been addressed, and the lifelong commitment, the walk the talk that they don't see. So these are the three areas I see that's very important to address from ourselves within our region and our country perspective as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjog. So that was quite a clear contrast to the approach that Juliet was sharing about women's-led initiatives. And I think from my kind of narrow understanding, there's a lot of organizations, people like me, you know, identify as men, come in and then want to do all this good work and then actually haven't thought about a lot of the things that women's organizations have been thinking about for generations. So we are talking about identities here. And so I'm going to very, you know, unapologetically, I would love to hear, Layla, what you think, because you are a woman leading an organization. And so, yeah, if we're talking about individual identity, making you have a certain perspective, a certain, you know, experiential background or angle on engaging with men, what's your experience of this as someone who is leading an organization that has a strong focus on engaging men and boys?
Well, thank you. It's a big question. Well, there are a lot of things overlapping. Well, I would say that it's challenging because there is also being a female person and leading an organization that's working with men, there is a lot of explanation that needs to be done. And I would say that it took quite a lot of years for, first of all, my organization, which exists from 2010, but it was led by men. And there was a big difference when it was led by men. It was somehow self-understood that these are, that was, or the most of the team were male people, that these are the people who want to work on positive masculinities and who want to transform masculinities because they're men themselves and they're not happy with how world looks like. And this was not strange and no one was questioning this. But for me, coming on this place, it was in 2015 that I came to Status M, and being a female, there was quite a lot of proving I had to do toward my women feminist colleagues in Zagreb, I would say, and in wider region, because somehow it was okay, but working with men is giving to men more space. And then are we in competition because we are taking funds for working with women? So there was quite a lot of challenges, and it took quite a lot to prove that we are on the same page. And with some women organization, still there is a challenge because we would cooperate, but we are not working as much as we could. And somehow it's difficult because we are talking about cooperation all the time, about intersectionality all the time, but in our daily life, sometimes it's very challenging. Also, kind of recognition for Status M work and my work also comes from the place when some big feminist organization in region would recognize us. This is somehow okay, we are approved, and it's strange place to be in. And Sanjog just reminded me, there is also quite a lot of men who are following our work, and because on the beginning they think we are men's right organization. And we, for example, had recently Father's Festival, and we had a lot of followers on Facebook, but then it turned out that quite a lot of followers thought because of our name and what we do that we are men's organization. And when they realized we are not, then they started attacking us. So it's quite challenging. And going back, Tom, to your question, for me it's also interesting because actually I'm of mixed origin. So part of my roots are European and Balkan, but part of my roots are Arab, and this also comes with certain challenges of living here and working here and doing what I'm doing. So it's good because it puts you in a good place for international cooperation, but in a daily life it's quite challenging. So I hope I answered your question, or it's not that easy, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Leila. And sorry for picking on you, but that was really enlightening and just really interesting to hear your personal experience as a leader of an organization in a context where people assumed that actually you're talking about men, you must be for men's rights, yeah, rather than a feminist women's rights gender transformative approach. So I think that kind of answers a little bit, Sanjog, your question as well about how are pro-feminist movements perceived. I just want to, I do want to move on to some other questions because there were so many. I'm just going to ask if Juliet, Reefat, or Marcel, either of you, would like to come in on any of the points shared just now.
Yeah, for me, I think it just flips the question, because is it Leila? Yeah, it has found herself in another situation where she's working with in an organization which is supposed to be men, and she has to explain herself several times. In this part of the region, it's the other way around, where men have to explain themselves why they are working on women's issues. So for me, it has flipped my question. I didn't realize that it can also be that way.
And Reefat and Marcel, be interesting to hear your thoughts on this topic as well, on the perception or the reception of this work. We're seeing a bit of a contrast, and I think it is very complex how this work is perceived or its origins. And it would be good also, I think, to reflect on what's the desirable way to do this work. Because it sounds, Juliet, like in your context that actually women's rights organizations are focusing on women's rights have thought we need to engage men. And I've heard that a lot from other contexts, especially, for example, the Athena Network, working a lot in Africa as well, in other countries in Africa, have like Mamas Club, that they focused on engaging the mamas. This is, I'm sharing something that one of our board members shared with me, Lydia. The mamas in the Mamas Club in Uganda said, we want you to engage with men. So it really came from women. So I think maybe Marcel, what are your thoughts on this? We're coming in, I speak for myself, I'm coming in as a man. Is it more desirable that it's kind of, we're not taking leadership, how are we doing what does it mean for accountability, how this work originates and how it's perceived in the region, in your context? And that's a question for you, Marcel, if you can hear. Or if we can't get you right now, Reefat, are you still online?
Yes, I am. Yeah. Okay. I mean, great discussion and the great experience from different regions. I think what Sanjog mentioned, we have the similar context here in Bangladesh as well. One thing I want to make it very clear is that in Bangladesh, probably we're all well aware, is that there is a huge work on women empowerment from microfinance, for example, because earlier it's a very conservative country here, and women were not so much coming out of the household. They were very much confined to their homestead, doing the household chores and other work. But because of microfinance and other women empowerment programs that was led mostly by the national organizations like BRAC and big institutions, basically it was a big shift that women were coming out, they were organized, they were sitting in a club, they were talking, they were doing income opportunities through microfinance. So it was a big shift both from the women's side, because they felt more confident. And I'm talking about the very poor families, very rural families from the most hard-to-reach areas where women didn't have any access even to their local level. So from that point of view, I think the big shift for the women themselves, that, okay, they can organize themselves, they can make changes among themselves. And also for the community who is very much patriarchal in Bangladesh, and it was very difficult for them to really accept that women are coming out of the house, they have the mobility and they are going there. So definitely there were a lot of challenge. It was needed a lot of shift both on both sides, as I mentioned. But now we know that in Bangladesh it's a reality. But when it comes to movements, as you were saying, I would say there are two types of movements we have experienced in Bangladesh, because we have a rich development history, and the movement is also, we have some histories of movement here. I mean, movement, but I think India and Nepal has also very good experiences. But in Bangladesh also we have a lot of experience of movement, be it land rights, be it indigenous people's movement, be it for the sex workers, be it disability people's movement. We have those experiences here. But in many cases, there are two types. One is organic movement, very much led by the people themselves who are really part of that group, member of that group. Also, there are other movements led by different NGOs or civil society organizations. And as Sanjog was mentioning, in many cases it was projectized, in many cases it was developed, moved by the organizations, led by the organizations. And when it comes to when those are not organic, certainly sustainability becomes an issue. If it is projectized, very much is linked to a particular project, and the project goes out, the movement might suffer to some extent in terms of leadership. Who's going to lead that after the project is gone? Because in many cases, it's NGO themselves are leading, for example. But the organic movements that I'm talking about, real people's movement that I'm talking about, in those cases, certainly there is a more likelihood of sustainability in terms of, because it comes from within and it grows and grows. But when it comes to feminist movements, I would say same as Sanjay mentioned, is in many cases it is very much woman-led. Many of the NGOs or the women themselves have led many of those movements. It was not so much that I have seen is that the men are leading those movements, unless it is very much NGO-centric. Then, if we talk about the MENEngage network in Bangladesh, it was founded about 15 years back, and it was basically led by the Sadish Children. Sweden, Denmark at that point of time sort of came up with this idea, and they have from the Global MENEngage Alliance, and then they founded this network in Bangladesh. Okay, and they sort of gathered other NGOs, and then sort of a discussions, deliberations, and then sort of it came up as a network. And gradually, then we have other movements joining in this network as part of MENEngage network. So I would say that definitely we have similar experiences in terms of movements, but I think organic movements have more, I would say, more impact or more credibility across the different actors and at least in the community.
Thanks, Reefat, for that excellent reflection. And I'm also just looking at one question I would like everyone to reflect on, which was Reefat's question from earlier, which is, we often want to talk about and celebrate what's gone really well, but we don't often talk about the things that didn't go so well and what we can learn. So I'm just going to ask everybody to try it. Well, we won't go to it now because I want to give you a bit of time to think about it. But if you have some idea of something that didn't go well, we'll come back to it later. So no pressure, just to think of it on the spot. But let's come back later to something that didn't go well. I want to hear all the best examples of things that didn't go that well, but we learned from, so that we can learn from those things. So yeah, I think then another question also from Reefat actually was, how did different sectors work together in different regions? I would love to hear a bit more about that. So the question, if I understand rightly, was there's partnerships are needed. It's between community organizations, NGOs, INGOs, donors, governments. How do those kind of relationships work? Reefat, is that a good reflection of your question from earlier?
Very much so, but I would add two more actors, which we often like the private sector. I think that's a very influencing actor in the community, and also I would say the creative people. It could be storytellers, it could be communication guys, it could be marketing agencies, it could be media agencies, it could be even academics. Those who do the creative part of it, because they should have a lot of influence in making the changes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for that clarification, because that's immediately made me think to go to Shay as someone who's worked across both sides of private sector, creative, with a background in communications, using creative approaches, in a more corporate world, if I understand from back in the day for you. But then, yeah, what do you think about how collaborations work in this kind of area between private, public sector, third sector, or non-profit sector, and so on?
I think just this might be an answer to that question and Reefat's other one, which is when it goes wrong, and how we can end up in a kind of dialogue of the deaf, where because of ethos and structures and habit, we can misunderstand each other hugely. So academic world running on one stream, the private sector running on another stream, and then government bureaucracy running on another stream, in ways of thinking that, and we miss each other along the way, and we find it really difficult to cooperate, and we find it really difficult to hear each other. I'm thinking in particular of a task that we were involved in, which was bringing gender mainstreaming to the health service, which is a bureaucracy with 100,000 people in it, which is hugely gendered, and just the struggle of government, and people whose thinking is within a biomedical model, so it's very rational, and how we really struggled to hear each other. And until we actually said that, I don't know who it was said, somebody reached out and said, we're really not hearing each other very well in this. We seem to be missing each other's point. And to stop and pull back and agree first principles, things that we thought we agreed on, and had to go back to the beginning again halfway through a process. And that was the big learning, that we somebody was brave enough to put their hand up and say, stop, we really need to listen to each other differently, because we have these different backgrounds and we come to these things in different ways. And it was a really seminal moment for that. I remember, referring back to the other question, I remember at one of those meetings, a woman from a feminist organization turned to me to say, I had no right to be there, because this was gender mainstreaming, that was about improving women's lot in the health service. And just from there on, things began to change. So I think that's a really important thing, is to stop and think about the ethos and the ways of thinking within organizations, especially, and I hear Reefat say about the commercial sector, the private sector. In Ireland, we have a huge presence of things like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, are massive organizations employing thousands of people, and they have brought their way of being in the world into this country, and that has changed it. And they want to be involved in this world, although for their very own reasons. They have a particular wish, and they wish to be seen as hugely liberal. We had a referendum to allow for same-sex marriage in the past couple of years, and those companies came out hugely for that. But inherently, they are conservative organizations, so they have this kind of Janus-like personality. So I think we have to understand their context in terms of when we're stepping in, and we have to understand their motives, but understand their ways of being and the things that they take for granted and don't say. Thanks.
Yeah, very interesting. Talking about some of the big guns of the corporate world that in working in Ireland. But I also want to, let's stick with Europe for a second, but way over in Croatia. Is this, what's your experience then of these kinds of partnerships between different sectors? Leila?
Well, I'm thinking now. I would say Okay, there are some, as always, good things and the bad things. My organization, we worked quite a lot with a justice system, with the penal system, because we also work with men in prisons and with young people in prisons. I would say that a lot of our work was dedicated to changing how things work inside the system. It's challenging. The moves are visible and changes are visible, but they're very, very small, and it's draining for everyone who are working on it. Often we would find very good allies, but it is always the challenge with people who are within the system, how powerful they are. And we are trying, as any organization, to do public advocacy and to do lobbying, and also to work with people who are within, but also we have changes of government and people with different political agendas, and somehow even when we would think things are going great, someone will make a decision, okay, this year we are not financing NGOs who are working within the justice or penal system anymore. So it's very challenging, and I would say with the health system, because there is quite a big initiative, and quite a lot of NGOs, feminist NGOs here, are working on improving position of women, especially giving a birth within the health system in Croatia. And this is also a big topic, and a lot of discrimination going on, and a lot of discrimination from side of doctors and male doctors as well. And it's very difficult, because people are aware, and let's say that the common people who are facing horrible experiences are aware what the problems are, but as long as we are not touching the system, we exist together. But as soon as we want to enter and make a big change, I mean, it's the story of any NGO, it becomes an issue. I'm also thinking now, okay, there are changes, because, for example, part of the work we are doing is about parental leave. But in my region, a lot of the things are coming because we are part of European Union. So our decision makers and policy makers are aware that we have to change something. So because it's European Union, there is, let's say, someone outside who will look into Croatia, and then they will say this is not good enough. So this is also thing that colleagues were mentioning before. Is it organic movement, or is it from top down? And it really makes a difference. I'm thinking about what She was saying about cooperation with the private sector, and this is something that we are learning. It's a big thing, because private sector is employing big numbers of people, big numbers of also male people that we are working with. And so far our only experience was about trying to introduce parental leave to private companies. And it's very difficult, because it's a systemic problem. Coming together with men being more paid, with also men not having a role of taking care of families, so also not having in mind the parental leave as such. But also there was also quite a lot of cases of discrimination when men wanted to use their right to parental leave. They were discriminated mostly by their bosses in private sector. And somehow we realized that as long as we are talking about children's rights in private sector, this is easy. So as long as something is about child's rights, children's rights, somehow this is the topic that people would get together around. But there are, I don't know how to say, there are these lines. So everyone are aware about private social responsibility. There is big awareness. But then when you would say, okay, but it is also children's right that parents are home, or it is also children's right that his or her father are home at early age, then this is the point where we have to negotiate and see how to move on. I think also it's not specific for Europe. It's not, it's not specific for Croatia. I think that being in NGO in any part in the world, it comes with this, it comes with big challenges. So I would maybe also like to hear how my colleagues here in a panel from different regions deal with it. So I hope I answered.
Yeah, and thanks, thanks, Leila. I think that was really interesting. You both had kind of context based on engaging with healthcare and challenges, but then also private sector, and especially the context of having the European Union as well, which is, a very, I guess, a very, very well established intergovernment agency. Some regions have similar, some don't, so it would be good to hear a bit more about that. I thought we could go back to colleagues in Africa, and I especially want to hear, Marcel, if you're able to hear us now, because we didn't hear you last time. So are you there? And what are your thoughts on this topic of how partnerships work across sectors in your context? And you're muted now, so I don't know if you need to just...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me now? This is Marcel.
Yeah, we got you now. Hi, go ahead, Marcel.
Yes, let me just quickly put my...
We lost you, Marcel. In fact, I can't even see Marcel on the call anymore. I don't know if he just got cut off just at the moment where we'd heard from him again. So how about we come back to Marcel in a little bit while. Juliet, what's your experience of cross-sector partnerships in Zambia?
You mean partners like the cooperating partners, CSOs?
Yeah, I think we've had a bit of a focus on the private sector partnerships, but also government, community organizations, and any partnerships that span across different sectors, after just hearing how some of the challenges in Europe. And then I think after that, I think we can go hopefully to Marcel, and then again back to colleagues in South Asia. But Julia, if you want to share what the situation is in your context first.
Yeah, okay. In Zambia, partnership works well in communities where we talk on issues of gender-based violence, gender inequalities, because we assume that that's where these inequalities are. But when it comes to the private sector, it's difficult to penetrate. Like, for example, we have some organizations where the owners do not want to ensure that gender equality issues are championed in their organizations. Like, for example, you would find an organization which only employs men and which does not take into consideration issues of gender equality. So it's quite difficult to penetrate. Some 2 years ago, our government came up with a law called Gender Equity and Equality Act. And part of that law came a commission, which has powers to even go to the private sector and other institutions to go and ensure that there's gender equality there. So we are hoping that maybe that will assist us and we'll be able to penetrate in such areas. It's easier to work with community leaders, religious leaders, traditional leaders within the communities. But then when it comes to private institutions, it becomes different. But I also wanted to address the other question on what hasn't worked so well, because we are just celebrating on what has worked well, but we also need to talk about what hasn't worked well. in Zambia, it's quite difficult to raise resources to work on boys' issues because most of the resources are concentrated on girls' issues. So we have this work on sensitizing boys on issues of gender so that when they grow, they start practicing issues of gender, they are already sensitized, and they grow into gender-sensitive men. But it has been very, very difficult to raise funds. It's actually easier to raise funds for men to do work on gender equalities. But when it comes to issues for boys, normally the question is that why do you want to empower boys? Why can't you ask for money to empower girls? So I think that's one of the areas where we have kind of struggled.
Hello.
Thanks, Juliet. And
Yes,
thanks for those. Yeah, hi Marcel. Yeah, we can go to you now if you're. It sounds like you're connected, and yeah, we can see you as well. So yeah, thanks Juliet for those reflections, and over to you, Marcel.
Thank you very much. I think we have quite some useful examples back in Malawi here. First, we are glad that we have worked very well with both private sector organizations and also other male-dominated organizations. For example, the Malawi Electricity Supply Commission of Malawi, ESCOM, engaged the Men for Gender Equality Now to facilitate the gender and social inclusion program within the electricity transmission company. The premise why they had to engage us was that the company was largely male-dominated, and the notions that the men in those companies had around gender were to do with purely that it's a women's issue, and therefore men have nothing to do with that. And since they were many men, they didn't see a role in that. But after they engaged us and we facilitated all the process, all the 2,700 men working for the establishment were trained and engaged, and they have continued to be engaged. Like I indicated earlier on, as we talk now, today, we are already at this hour facilitating another intervention. There are two companies of the same electricity generation company, which generates the electricity from hydro, and then the Electricity Supply Commission, which supplies the electricity across the country. So today we are engaging the electricity generation company. The idea is that largely all the workers, many of them were male. And we are trying to say, how do they create spaces for women? So it's not just a question of social responsibility, but it's a question of how do we ensure that technical organizations, technical private sector, that for a long time have seen themselves as male-dominated, can begin to create spaces for women. Secondly, like I've also highlighted, we also work with the Malawi Police Service and the Malawi Defense Forces, because these organizations are also male-dominated. And when you look at the private police officers and their families, sometimes you might assume that because they are in the police service and they enforce laws, it means they are very correct men and they cannot do any form of violence in their families. And even if the violence were to occur, it may not be reported because it's a little bit controlled institution. So we are glad that as Men for Gender Equality Now in Malawi, who is part of the MENEngage Alliance, Malawi, we have been able to engage police officers, and they are part of those who are now advocating for gender-based violence and men's engagement in a number of activities. So we are moving on with our initiatives to try to bring on board as many private sector organizations, because the new Gender Equality Act, which passed 2 years ago, requires that every organization in Malawi, including the private sector, should embrace 60-40. Either 40% of the employees have to be women and 60 men, or 60% of all employees have to be men and 40 women. So, I mean, either 40 men and 60 women, or 60 men, 40 women, something like that. So we are trying to create that broad-based awareness so that they can begin to prepare in creating space and in ensuring that their conditions are fair, so that women can equally participate in those. By talking about fair, it doesn't mean creating conditions that are easier for women, no. But if men are not embracing diversity, it will become a little bit harder for women to work in such establishments. On the ground at community level, we are also trying to work with all the traditional structures, and most of them are male dominated. So we are now having male champions who are traditional leaders, who are beginning to challenge their own patriarchal setups and begin to bring in women to participate in the process. Like I had indicated earlier on, so far we haven't received the resistance from the feminist organizations, because they have seen that we are actually confronting structures that our fellow women organizations have done very well, have worked very hard to confront over the years, but because the patriarchal systems were changed, sometimes the efforts did not yield as much. But we congratulate the women's movement for sustaining the gender equality agenda for all these years, and that's why we are joining them to see if together we can make a difference in bringing about equality, both of opportunity and also in ending gender-based violence. So I think we have some examples in Malawi, and we have facilitated the development of what we call gender and social inclusion policies for these organizations. So far, including the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation, which is the main broadcaster in Malawi and has employees of up to 700, we also trained all of them and developed the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation Gender and Social Inclusion Policy, so that even as they broadcast to the nation, they shouldn't use sexist language. They should not use language that is demeaning to a particular gender. And I think this helps to create a broad-based understanding of equality issues across the nation, because the media reaches out to so many people at one go. So we think if we target the media, we target other male-dominated organizations, we target the traditional structures, we are of the view that together we can reach somewhere in terms of challenging the dominant forms of masculinity. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. And I think that's a lot of really powerful examples. It sounds like you're having a big impact across, private sector media as well. The only problem with the response is that we're going to ask in a bit for examples of failures. So it sounds like you're having a lot of impactful and successful programming there. So thanks for sharing that. And do start thinking also about a good example of something that went wrong, because not went wrong, but didn't go as well as we'd hoped, because we'll come back to that question, to you in a bit, Marcel.
But before you do that, can I just add to indicate that it is also important to note that all these efforts were not financed by ourselves as it were. It was financed by those very organizations after noting that they have a deficiency. Because funding is a very serious problem for many of the MENEngage work. Because no one really, some donors are not really forthcoming to understand the nature of our work. But only if the private sector themselves and other organizations have begun to understand our work, they are able to put it within their budget and bring us on board to facilitate the engagement process. So I think that is also very important to note, because our friends might think we have a lot of money to reach out to all these organizations. No, it's not like that. It's because those organizations have deliberately put aside resources and they have just brought us in to facilitate the processes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very impressive, and thanks for sharing. So we've got some examples from Europe where maybe companies are really invested in this kind of programming on gender, but it's also, Shay was mentioning a bit about image. And then I think Juliet was sharing that actually there's a lot of resistance from these male-dominated organizations. As soon as you try and get into a private sector situation in Zambia, it's really challenging. But thanks, Marcel, for sharing those examples from Malawi of actually really getting in there and being with organizations actually funding those programs as well, which is really, really important. So yeah, I just want to go and see what it's like in Nepal, what it's like in Bangladesh. So Sanjog, how about we go to you first for your experience, then we'll go back to the person who actually initiated this discussion point, Reefat.
Sure. You know that as soon as we talked about the private sector, the terms profit comes together. You know that the private sector looks everything and from the profit. So there are some of the private sector who have tried to portray the women's rights through their creative ideas to sell their products in various religious or cultural occasions. The problem is that the not having the conceptual clarity and exaggerating the men's engagement and men's role through the advertisement, the movie, actually creates and actually gives the backlash to the men-gaze movement. You know, so I think that is also the reason that why the feminists are not happy with when men create those things. You know that it's when you look from the profit perspective, and then they're not clear about, they are not conceptually clear and they're committed towards the issue. And number two is, whenever it's related to the profit, they're welcoming. But whenever we I think Lucy has also shared that whenever we try to talk about the governance and gender, whenever we talked about the equal payment or the paternity leave or maternity leave, this kind of thing, and they are not welcoming that much enough. So there's something that we really need to work on that perspective as well. And also, you know, that in terms of development organization, when I see the men-gaze movement in our country, at the very early phase, there was a lots of the UN organization and NGOs were supporting the men-gaze movement, but later they somehow stopped. And the reason when I talked to them, they said that the team now, the people who are the part of the men-gaze do not have that much conceptual clarity that it should have been. And I always argue, if they do not have, why not we invest them, because you have money or you have knowledge, and then bring these people with the knowledge, and then we can work together. So this kind of gap is always there with the organization, which are very much gender equality centric, and these are the group of people who want to work with men and boys, but there's somehow these gaps, and there's no one who can bridge these gaps. And I think that's also the problem. That's why our movement is not as it's supposed to be. So these are the two things that I see as a gap when we see the engagement of public and then the private sector, and then why there's somehow kind of a backlash over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjog. And I actually want to wrap this question up by going back to Reefat. Actually, maybe you could share a bit in response to your own question about how partnerships work, and what did you learn actually from hearing about others' experiences from different contexts?
Okay, first of all, I would really thank everyone for sharing your experience, which is great. In Malawi, for example, very good practices, good examples, and from other parts as well. And I would sort of echo with what Sanjog said, because we have almost similar context. So I think in Bangladesh also, as he said, is that certainly private sector comes with a profit, intent of profit, even when they invest in NGO work through their corporate social responsibility funding and so on. So certainly they also think what they can really make the profit out of it. It can be a grant, but they want to see that there is a return on investment. I'll just give you an example. It's not an NGO intervention, but how the private sector can have different mindset, change their mindset. In one of our advertisement, in one of the product they're promoting, it's about a spice that you can use the spices in your cooking, right? And initially, when the advertisement went out in one of the big companies in Bangladesh, they were showing that the boy and the mother is telling to the boys that I mean, the boy was very happy with his mother's cooking, and that, okay, mother, I really love your cooking, and it reminds me of my childhood that I've been getting all those things. And then the mother says that, okay, so now it's time that you bring a wife who can cook for you. So it's sort of promoting that the wife is meant to be the person who will be cooking for the husband, and then this advertisement created a huge backlash by the NGOs, by the women's rights movement, and so on. And this very company then sort of probably understood, and the media agencies also, because most of the products are developed by the creative people. That's why we're saying creative people. So media agencies, or those who made this thing, they have changed the whole thing. And then the next advertisements for the same product was like that: the wife is out, she's working, and the man is at home, and now he can cook very easily with his ready-made spices and everything. And he's setting the table, and the wife comes back from the work. He says he sees that the table is ready for her, and they eat together. So you see, I mean, through the creative people is also changing their thing. Earlier it was differently portrayed, now they're having a different thing. Again, there's another advertisement where we see that a woman, she's going through menstruation, and she gets up, and the husband brings the sanitary pad for the, I know that you are now ill, and you are now having menstruation, so I already have the sanitary pad for you. So it looks at how the husband is very much caring about her wife's reproductive rights and everything. So I see there are changes, and one of the reasons for this I see is that there are a lot of engagement with the NGO, these designers, creative designers, and the private sector. So this dialogue, this engagement is really helping the way they have been thinking earlier. So earlier they were sort of promoting this preconceived notion of women, but now there are some shifts. Still, there are a lot of way to go, as Sanjog mentioned, but certainly I see some positive changes there. But the dialogue is very important. I think regular dialogue is important, so that both can learn from each other, that how we can really, I mean, the private sector can also learn from us. But on the other hand, I think the private sector, one of the major challenge, criticism of the NGOs that private sectors often say is that you make things very complex. You use too much jargons. You cannot say things simply. Whenever we are talking, even the one right now, we are talking about very difficult words, masculinities, toxic masculinities. We are talking about jargons, right? So these things is very difficult for to communicate. So the private sector wants very simple words. So sometimes I think we struggle. We don't really know what people want to hear from us, what private sector wants to hear from us. So I think that's where probably also we need to change ourselves. We need to make things clear, because we need to communicate, right? So communication has to be very simple and clear, not in our own jargon, but probably the audience's jargon. We need to really learn that as well.
Absolutely, thank you. I think, yeah, especially in my time I've been involved in this, I think there's been a lot of discussion about us being more clear and speaking everyday kind of language that people really understand. And I think there's a lot of push. I know people on this call have even been raising that, so something for us all to think about as well. But yeah, that was a really good example from Bangladesh as well, about changing in an advert. So we've heard that good example. We heard some really good examples from Marcel. I want to ask now, what are the kind of, not bad examples, but good examples of things that didn't quite go right, but maybe we learned from? And I'm not going to necessarily go around everybody, but I would invite you to share something if you do have a good example. So yeah, does anyone have a good example they'd like to share? Maybe you've already got it in your head. If so, please do speak up. And before we do that, there's a few others on the call. I just want to make sure everybody's invited to raise your hand. You can ask questions in the chat box. There's a little raise hand feature somewhere in Zoom. Otherwise, just write a message in the chat box, and you can also then I'll let you know to unmute, and you can share a question as well, or an example. So yeah. But anyone who, from our panelists, do you have an example you'd like to share of something that went badly or could have gone better?
Yeah, maybe I can share something.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. One of the, sorry.
Yeah.
on one of the good examples that we, as a women's movement in Zambia, for a long time, we struggled on issues of early child marriages, early marriages and child marriages, because in Zambia, we have what we call a dual legal system. So we have our statutory law, we also have our customary laws. And you know, customary laws are driven by traditional leaders, and in most of those customary laws, you find that children's rights and women's rights are actually abused. Like, for example, in some customs, a child as early as 9 up to 12 can be married off as long as they've attained puberty. So one of the good examples that have worked in our country is using traditional leaders. So because the traditional leaders in society, they are given much respect and they are feared so much. So we worked with the traditional leaders to ensure that they address the issue of early marriages, withdrawing children from school, and they dealt with it traditionally. And most of the traditional leaders have been made champions of early marriages and child marriages. As a result, the cases have even gone down. And I think Zambia is one of the countries where we are doing so fine in that area. Because what happened was traditional leaders decided to now start sensitizing their subjects, the people that report to them. And also they are the ones that came up with the laws because it's done traditionally. So a traditional leader would say things like, if I see you marrying off girls who are withdrawing them from school and you are marrying them off, then as a family, as a traditional courts will be able to punish you. So most of the people have been obliging. So many girls have been withdrawn from early marriages and now they are back in school.
Great. And what were are there any big challenges that you faced or that have been experienced in that, Juliet? Because that sounds like a really wonderful result, that early marriages are going down through that approach. And I'm just very glad to hear, but just also wanting to find out what are the really challenges that were overcome, what are the lessons learned as well?
The lessons learned is that we still need to back it with law, because there isn't like, for example, if you work with enlightened parents, they can challenge that in courts. There was a father who married off the child, and then later on, they were, because the police is used, they were taken to the police, and that family took the matter to court. And when they checked in our laws, it was found out that actually there isn't a law which really talks about the age of marriage. So we have a bill which is before Parliament and which we've been pushing for as a civil society organization, which will bring in the age of marriage. I think that will help, because if you start working with enlightened parents, if they know that there's a gap in the law, they can still take the matter to court and they can still win, like that family did. So we shouldn't take chances. We should ensure that our laws address such gaps.
Wow, well, that's really inspiring work and actions going on there. So thanks for sharing those as well. From any of the other speakers today, do we have any lessons learned, bits of wisdom from something that could have gone better? Shay.
We have a program which works with men that are violent in their relationships, the perpetrator program, and we work very hard. These are men that either come at their own suggestion or at the suggestion of partners or mediators. and there is a gap in that. In some countries there are programs that are court mandated, so that a judge, after a case of where a man has been violent, can mandate that he attends a perpetrator program. And we worked with part of the judges. First of all, it was a real battle. It's a real battle in Ireland to talk to judges in any fashion. But eventually, a judge did agree that he might mandate men that came before him to join the program. And they did that, and there were some men mandated. And those programs work in groups that are facilitated by a man and a woman, and they also work with the partner who has been on the receiving end of the violence, as a way of checking on his performance. But the difference in attitude of the man who was court mandated, who was turning up because if he didn't turn up, he would have to do jail, was really different, and its impact on the group, because there were men who had come of their own will, and men who had to be there to stay out of jail, and the attitude was different, and it became a dysfunctional group. So it was really, really difficult to make those group work. So the structure, that system failed to a certain extent. It's still being developed, but certainly the initial stages of it was that what felt like a really good idea, but the whole system wasn't taken into account.
Thanks for sharing. And I wonder if that sparked any thoughts in anyone else. Please let me know, because that reminds me of a workshop I've done once where it just went so badly. And it was just, I think it was a different context. It was school children, but I think a few of the boys in the class had a really strong agenda. They'd obviously well read on men's rights kind of issues, or like that kind of politics, that kind of ideology, and just totally derailed the whole session. So, and I came up feeling like it was a big disaster. So yeah, thanks for sharing that experience as well. Did you come up with any alternatives or ways to navigate that?
I haven't been involved in that work since.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult to kind of, do you separate people out? Do you try and bring people together to help foster more exchange of different views? I'm going to suggest we move on to kind of the wrap-up question, so everyone has a couple of minutes to share, unless anyone has any other examples of things that they learn a lot from.
May I add one regarding this engagement of private company? That how we portray. That when I see the portrayal of women in a market is like, earlier there is no existence of women, and then certainly in an advertisement there is a women portrayed as a sexual object, and then women as a market. That they can sell portraying the women. And now these days they're talking about rights, that my friend from Bangladesh also shared that. But again, we need to be a very strongly and need to deep down, when they portray the women. For example, there's one advertisement which is praised by lots of the families and the people. There's a advertisement on washing machine where the man goes to his daughter's home, and what he observes is that his daughter is working, she's in rush, and then her child is nagging her, and her husband is asking for coffee, and then she needs to work in a kitchen and also take care of child, and then her husband is watching TV. So the father feels that, and he writes a letter to his daughter that, sorry, that I've never done the household chores, and because of that you have certain kind of image of man and what to expect from your husband. And it also because your my son-in-law or your husband also had this image because of his father was also like me. So I'm very sorry. So he writes that letter, and people says, oh, this is a very good advertisement. But that instead of saying sorry, what if this man would have stood up and went to his son-in-law and asked, let's do the household chores together. that would change the paradigm of home. Just writing a letter is not going to change. So this kind of clarity is very much needed in a private sector, and this is something that and this kind of wrong portrayal actually backlash the MENEngage movement. They see this ad and they see us, that talking about the women's rights or being a ally of feminist movement. So they kind of try to compare with each other. I think that is the kind of backlash I see while involving the private sector, and we have to be very cautious on that. Just I would like to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. It makes me think that, if people are saying, oh, well, they're lumping together the kind of work that you feel you are involved in with something they found problematic. It makes me think, oh, well, maybe it's my responsibility. Maybe they think it's our accountability to us that we as, speaking generally, should be ones to do the work to call out that kind of thing. Because otherwise, if people who are working on men and masculinities for gender equality are not calling out problematic adverts, then that does, beg the question of should we be actually being more vocal at the appropriate time. But yeah, thanks for sharing. Another advert related one. So we had a lot about the commercial sector and branding and stuff and representation throughout this. Yeah, I think we're going to just kind of have a round of a couple minutes each. The question is fairly simple, but something I'm quite curious about, and hopefully you are as well. It's all about, what do you think we should work together on cross-regionally? What issue or what strategic area or something like that? Where can we collaborate better? If you have just 2 minutes to kind of pitch your issue or your approach or your strategy, what would you like to work on together? So I'm going to start with our colleagues in, let's go with Europe first, if we can hear from Leila this time first.
Oh, it's a difficult question again, and it's still early morning. There is this best practice exchange going through my mind, but I'm thinking now, okay, but what does it mean really, best practice exchange? Because something that maybe worked here won't work somewhere else because of different context, and the other way around. But I would still go with this word, best practice exchange, when it comes to advocacy and also with direct work with people, because still there is this, I would think, a big moment of inspiration that comes out. So maybe it's not about best practice, about taking it like a system and now somebody did it somewhere else in some part of the world and it worked and now we have to transplant it. But it's more about how people manage to do something and getting inspiration out of it, and then think within our system, how do we change it to get what we would like to do. And I'm saying this because sometimes it's really not enough. I mean, sometimes it looks very simple to just look into other region, and often for us here, I can say it's like a Western Europe, but sometimes it really doesn't work, and it's still geographically close, and not to talk about the wider globe. And what I think is more important, just to hear this like good examples, and some of them we had here, and just to see what was the driving force and what were the main negotiating points and what were the entry points for us to change something. I also think that we should have bigger exchange of, I would say, maybe common people and smaller voices. I think that we are at least in my perspective, we look at big organizations and we look for big names and we look for some, either they're famous, I don't know, in advertisement or actors, or we look for some big examples. But then we forget that actually in other regions, there are people who work every day with big challenges and who are still having this driving force and experience and who are motivational enough. I think this is something we tend to forget. And this is something that we should really do better. I also think it is on us to give the space and to open the space. I also think this panel is one of examples of opening the space. In matter of concrete things, I would always say we have to do advocacy together. We have to change the rules, change the laws. But I also understand it is so particular and it is so different around the globe that maybe we should still go for the big topics of human rights. But then I think we should still leave it to people who are dealing with it every day. I am also thinking about this role of a voice when it comes to big challenges, because I'm thinking, for example, something that is pretty cross-regional is a female genital mutilation, and I'm thinking all the time, does the topic become bigger because we in some parts of the world who are just better in having good commercial, having all this private sector working for us, lobbying also is a big sector that we didn't talk about. Are we doing it good for everyone because we are raising the issue, or we should maybe ask people who are really dealing with it in daily life how we should talk with decision makers, with policy makers, and with common people, how to change the traditions. So this is something that I always think maybe we should have more dialogue, because for us to work together, I need to understand what your challenge is. As long as I think I understand, it doesn't work. So yeah, I'm just also thinking about some examples we just heard today from the colleagues here, and I tend to forget. I have to be honest. I have so many problems here, and also European context or whichever context, that I just forget, that there are very strong people there who are very inspirational, and that we have to really give them a voice and listen to them, and not only think our system is better because our democracy is great and our European Union is amazing. So yeah, this is something I would go for advocacy, but I would also go from bottom up. So I would like
thank
to
you.
Shay. Now you.
Thank you. I go back to what I describe as fundamentals, and that is that I would like to spend time getting to know you and getting to hear more from you. We now have this fantastic facility called Zoom that allows us to sit in each other's homes or offices and hear each other. And I hear from most of you that we are outside the mainstream and that we're pushing against the stream. And I believe we can support each other and hear each other's struggle, and just paying good attention and hearing the struggle that's going on, for me, is valuable. And I offer that. And in that way that we begin to hear and know each other and learn from each other. And as Leila said, be inspired from each other. One of the things that I remember being asked, what does insight mean? And insight for me now means I never thought about it like that before. So hearing somebody from a different culture, from a different background, from a different region say something actually stops me and makes me think, I never thought about it like that before. And that really does change the way I understand things. And that's a real help. And I hope that some of the things that the way that I think does some similar work. It's, I think, a crucial thing that MenEngage in Europe has been doing for each other. And I think that a system like that, because we now have this, and we've got used to doing it, we've got used to sitting in these strange square rooms and hearing each other and paying good attention. Thanks.
Thanks, Shay and Leila. Yeah, maybe MenEngage's tagline should be, I never thought about it like that before, network. So, just for people to exchange and hear from different perspectives. So we're short on time, so let's carry on. Let's go to South Asia. Sanjog, what would you like to collaborate on more with other regions?
Okay, I've written some of the point here, and due to the time limit, I'll go one by one. I think the first thing is we need to look into the intersection and interject ideas to each other. However, but we shouldn't forget the contextualizing this. That I think this already my friend has said. And also the knowledge building is something that we really need to work in terms of MENEngage movement. For example, if I look from the Nepal perspective, we don't have that much resources to understand the MENEngage movement, to understand the pro-feminist, what works or what didn't work in a local language, in a local context. So I think that's very important. Third is co-creation and co-activism is very important so that we can inspire each other, and we can also make the show express our solidarity so that we're not alone and we can work together. I also think that we also need to activate our regional networks, the intra-regional and the inter-regional works, that within the region and within the region each other, like we're doing right now. The engagement of youth, this has to be a very important work that we need to work on, and also going from binary to spectrum is very important that we all will be working. And the last, I think we need to focus on changing the condition and the position of the women and the marginalized. Most of our work are focused on changing the condition, but only the changing the condition won't ensure that it will change the position of women and girls in our society and the country or the political sphere. I think these are some of the areas that I think we should be working. Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Sanjog, for that very clear and expansive list of ideas. So let's go again, a bit short on time, but I want to make sure everyone has a chance to share. So Reefat, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I would agree all the points what other colleagues have mentioned, Sanjog, Leela, and things. So I will just pick a couple of points. I think learning is mutual, and the whole purpose of this cross-regional thing that you are asking is basically how we can learn from each other. So I think learning is very much mutual. So from that point of view, I think we should really invest in community of practice. I think that's the best tool we can have to really discuss these things on a regular basis. Right now, we are discussing at regional level within the different countries, but I think this was a great opportunity to hear from the colleagues from other regions. But I don't think we should wait for a symposium to do this on a regular basis. I think community practice is the best platform that we can use. Secondly, I think as context issues came a number of times, but if you look at the themes here, I mean the 5 themes that we have here, I think the feminism, I think I consider it as more of an ideological framework. Intersectionality is something that exists, it's a reality. Accountability is something as a principle. I see it as a principle that we all should follow. But the last two, the transformation and power with, I think those as a more approach that we can really on a regular basis, we can do that. And this whole cross-regional work should be seen from power with perspective, how we can really garner support for each other and really increase our power to make the changes. But I also already agree with all what have been said, like joint research, joint evidence building, joint knowledge building, bottom-up approach. I totally agree on those aspects. And just following from what we have discussed in earlier section, I want to reinforce the fact is that private sector, creative sector, I think these are some of the sectors we need to engage more, because I see that we as a civil sector organizations, movements, we feel more comfortable to work with the development partners and with the government. And these are the sectors that we really try to shy away from. But if you want to really make big change, we have to reach out to them because their outreach is much greater than we have. So as I give example from commercial and other things. So maybe we need to really engage with them in a more meaningful way and create the dialogue, so that the message we are giving the right message, as Sanjog pointed it out.
Great, Thank you, Reefat. And I hope that this is a space that kind of helps spark some of these ideas for the future as well. So yeah, we do have a couple of minutes, but yeah, if we can make sure that Juliet and Marcel, you have a chance to share as well. So go ahead, Juliet, if you can hear me. Or Marcel, are you still there? I think Marcel's put his phone down for a second. Juliet, can you hear? You're on mute. Okay, so we can't get either of them at the moment, which is a shame. So we're kind of out of time. I'm going to quickly run through what we've got next again, because I'm expecting to have some kind of performance / discussion coming up next, which is about cabaret and masculinity, which sounds really, really interesting. It's going to be straight after this. We've only just put the message out there, so I'm hoping some people from social media will have seen that as well, because it was a last-minute booking, basically, or a last-minute initiative from the artists who are leading on that one. But yeah, we are gonna, let me see if I can share my screen. Here we go, yeah. So yeah, next up, it's two artists sharing cabaret theatre can be a tool for facilitating academic concepts for the general public. So that's something that's pretty exciting happening next. And like with other sessions, we are putting the recordings online. We've got a bit of a backlog, so it's taking a bit of time for us to put everything online, but we're trying to do so as quickly as possible. This will be online as well. Something I'll be checking out for sure. So I'm just gonna see Juliet or Marcel. Can you hear me now? And can you unmute and share your, very brief because we're at time now, but your wishes for what we could collaborate on more cross-regionally? Juliet? You are on mute, Juliet.
Hello?
Hi. Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had dropped off.
Yeah, we got you now. So the question is, briefly, just to wrap up, what would you like to collaborate more on across regions?
Okay. I think for us as Zambia, what we'd like to learn more is working with the private sector. I have seen, for example, like Malawi, they are doing quite fine, working with the police, working with the other institutions. And I've also seen Europe is also doing quite well in working with other institutions. So that is what we would like to learn in Zambia. It's been very difficult trying to engage with the private sector.
Okay, thanks, Julia. And that's been a bit of a theme across this. We did focus in a bit on the private sector. That's really interesting to hear that that's come out so much in this. It's not what I was expecting, but it sounds like there's been some real success stories doing approaches, working with public-private partnerships or NGO private partnerships, and even appetite to do more of that. And obviously we've talked about the influence that the private sector has through advertising quite a few times during this session. And it's for me been really interesting because I'm the communications coordinator supporting MenEngage with communications. So it's just interesting to hear a bit about everyone's different contexts, different adverts even we've heard. Maybe we should have a little space where we can all share the adverts to see what's to kind of track what's happening in different regions, how gender is being represented in different regions, and how it's changing, because it sounds like there's big changes happening all over the world with that regard for one reason or another. So yeah, that's kind of a brief summary, I guess, of the conversation. I'm still hanging on to see if we can still hear from Marcel, but it looks like Marcel has dropped off the call. So I hope this has been a good space for at least getting some of these conversations going. It's been nice to be able to kind of facilitate this discussion. So thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks for sharing. I hope you enjoyed the approach, because I kind of just focused on what we can learn from each other, and rather than diving deep into some of the topics that we all work on day in, day out. But thank you all. And we will, I'm going to stay on this call, but obviously this is the wrap up of this session. So thanks everybody. I'll always be staying on to start initiate this cabaret.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.